And furthermore, when I thought about, or when I would read about that the rise of Nazi power somehow challenged American security, or the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor really struck at the question of would America be secure? Well, when I was a kid, I spent once a month in school going through these air raid drills, where these were explicit acknowledgments that there might be a nuclear war in the next half hour, and you had to deal with this. And so when you thought about the kind of destruction that a nuclear war could wreak on the United States, well, what the United States suffered during the Second World War didn't seem like that big a deal. So anyway, I kind of steered clear of Franklin Roosevelt. And part of it was, for the reasons that I just explained, but part of it was I couldn't really get a handle on Roosevelt. I had studied his cousin, his fifth cousin, once removed, Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt has this historical persona that just leaps off the page and grabs you by the throat and shakes you upside down. Theodore Roosevelt was somebody that you simply couldn't miss historically. You might not like him. You might love him. You might not like him. But he was hard to get confused about. He was hard to be puzzled about. You had other reactions, but puzzlement wasn't one of them. Franklin Roosevelt's historical personality was much more understated. And with Franklin Roosevelt was not the kind of person, at least who was easy for me to like, to warm up to. I spent a lot of time studying Benjamin Franklin. I wrote a book about Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin was somebody that I admired going in, and I admired even more coming out, and I just really liked the guy. I'm pretty darn certain that I would have liked him in life if I had known him. He's a great guy to go out and have a beer with, somebody to talk about life. He was saying these things that just seemed really wise. And I remember when I was reading a collected edition of his letters. And I remember, it's etched in my mind, turning the page and reading the sentence where he said, and he really did say this, and he was in the letter, where he said, "There is nothing certain in this life but death and taxes." Well, this is something that Franklin is known for saying, and here he actually said it. There it was. And I thought this was terrific. And so he was an easy person to warm up to. But Franklin Roosevelt, I had a hard time with him. Partly it was his background. Partly he was this rich kid who had everything handed to him. Things came so easily to Franklin Roosevelt. Actually, I'll tell you the really flippant reason why I'm writing about Franklin Roosevelt. And it has to do with the fact that I had written about Benjamin Franklin, and I had written about Theodore Roosevelt. And when I give lectures like this, and I draw examples from history, I would often cite an example from Franklin's life, an example from Roosevelt's life, and often get them confused. And so I would say Franklin when I meant Roosevelt, and so I decided that I might as well really confuse audiences by throwing in somebody who's named for both of them. And then when I said Franklin but meant Roosevelt, you wouldn't know if I meant Roosevelt Franklin or Franklin Roosevelt. Anyway, but I finally decided, no, that I needed to take on Franklin Roosevelt because as a historian, a practicing historian, every now and then, Gleaves gets this all the time because he's specifically in the field of presidential studies. I get it less often, but quite regularly. Historians and political scientists take polls on who do you think the most important presidents, the greatest presidents, the most influential presidents, sometimes the adjectives change, are in American history. And there is a regular top three. Do you know who the top three always are? Lincoln, Washington, and Franklin Roosevelt. Yep, it's always those three. Sometimes they shift the order a little bit. So I knew that if I was going to understand American history, if I was going to try to relate the story of American history, I had to come to terms with Franklin Roosevelt. I also came to appreciate that the kind of things that were accomplished in Franklin Roosevelt's time as president, and I might have said were accomplished by Franklin Roosevelt, but I have to be a little bit careful here. It's a big country, a big government. You can't ascribe everything to the president. But the things that happened during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency were absolutely critical to understanding how America is, why America and how America is the way it is today. Do you know why those three are the top three in American history? It's not simply because they were the wisest. It's not because they had the best policies. Do you know why? It's because they led the country through crisis. If you want to make the top level of any historical category, you have to rise to a challenge. This is what really galled Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt realized that he would never be considered one of the great, truly great presidents. And on those lists, compiled by the historians and political scientists, he's in the near great category. Sometimes he rises as high as number 5. But he's never going to be considered the really great, and he knew perfectly well why. He was enough of a student of history to know that if you're going to get to the top, you have to be president during a crisis. Now, here's the irony of it. The great presidents presided over moments in American history that you wouldn't have wanted to live through. The Civil War was the worst disaster in American history. 600,000 Americans murdered one another in the name of Union, in the name of the Union or in the name of the Confederacy. And, you know, there are historians who like to say that this shows that democracy could defend itself. It confirmed the values of democracy. I don't think it did anything of the sort. I think it demonstrated an utter failure of democracy. Democracy is all about resolving differences by voting, not by shooting. Anyway, but Lincoln is considered right at the top because he led the Union through this crisis. Franklin Roosevelt, he led the Union through the country through two crises, the two greatest crises of the 20th century, of modern times, the Great Depression and World War II. Now, I hesitate to tell this audience, including those people who raised their hands earlier, that you wouldn't have wanted to live through that period. Well, I mean, you did. You didn't. We don't have a choice of when we live. But the fact is that the Great Depression was not a great time. And so Theodore Roosevelt's problem was that the government, the country, did too well while he was president. It was a time of peace and prosperity. And those are death to your historical reputation. Anyway, I have an alternative beginning for my book. And it goes like this. For 3.5 years, in the early 1940s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the most powerful man in the history of the world. He held the fate of humanity in his hands. What do you think? Is it a grabber? I've rendered you speechless. I guess it works. Now, needless to say, this is something that I can assert, and then I would have to go on and justify it and explain it. But I think it's absolutely true. And it comes down to this. The United States in the early 1940s was far and away the most powerful country in the world. Uniquely among the belligerents in World War II, the United States came out of the war absolutely stronger than it went into the war. Everybody else lost the war, even those allies of the United States on the winning side. The United States won the war, everybody else lost. Some lost absolutely, Germany and Japan preeminently. But Britain lost its empire. France lost its empire, or would shortly. The Soviet Union lost scores of millions of people. And even though the Soviets, even though the Russians, claim with some justification that they were the ones who really defeated Hitler, and that's true enough. Something like 75 or 80% of German casualties were taken on the Eastern Front. The Russians lost more than the Germans did. And although they were able to present themselves to the world as a superpower, everybody knew, well, at least American leaders knew, and Soviet leaders knew even more, that they simply weren't in the same class with the United States.